Hi all, welcome to GAMTpedia. This is Dr. Karthik and this is part 2 of the GAMT Recall Strategy where we are discussing the final pillar of the GAMT-based learning. If you haven't watched the first part, I encourage you guys to have a look at that before proceeding further. This one starts right off where the previous one left off, so we'll jump right in. GAMT, by making the recall very easy, exponentially increases the retention of content and also exponentially increases the time available for you. It's very important to put that into perspective and understand the benefit of GAMT. Okay, so because of this shorter interval of recall that you get with GAMT, you can play around with the recall strategy a bit. So with the GAMT, because it's a different technique, right? So it's not the usual technique, it's different technique. There are 4 types of recall that's possible. Something called mental recall, and something called visual recall, and there's a total recall, and there is zapping. Okay, let's go through them one by one. What is mental recall? So mental recall is the one that you will most commonly like to use. Say for example, you create a new GAMT. Okay, so the next day what you try to do is you try to recall this GAMT in your mind, right? You're not seeing anything, but you have to recall the GAMT in your mind. Let's take the GAMT learning framework, GAMT, for example. So let's say this is the recent GAMT that you learned, and what you're trying to do is trying to recall this as many times as possible in the first 24 hours. So this may be when you are brushing, or when you're walking to university, walking to school, or in the bus, or waiting in the car in the traffic, etc. So what you do is just mentally go through the GAMT. You don't need to look at anything physically, so it's just all mental process. So you just go through the various aspects of the GAMT. So in this example, the GAMT learning framework, you think about overview, figures, creating a GAMT, asking a lot of why question, going to compare in the contrast zone, spending some time in the association zone, and the association can be multiple different types of association. Then you're going to spend some time in applying the knowledge category. You're going to look at past exam questions, and in the applying knowledge category, you're going to do some problem-based questions and try to teach others, and then you're going to look at research and innovation, right? So what you've done is you've done a very quick mental recall of the GAMT. This probably took less than a minute. And what you've done effectively is you've kind of managed to blunt the forgetting curve at a very early stage. One thing to remember for this mental recall of the GAMT is that if you cannot recall a particular aspect of the GAMT, you need to go back to clarify it. You need to go back and look at the image to make sure you have it right. Okay, this is important. So that is called mental recall. So mental recall this is a mental process, as the name suggests. Try to recall mind, try to recall all the individual aspects of the GAMT. If you can associate the GAMT learning framework along with it as well, it's good. So that's the mental recall. You open the topic and you probably have 10 GAMTs in the topic. So you look at the first topic, let's say the one that we discussed in the last video is different types of extraordinary products. And before you look into some, do the same thing as the mental recall, where you recall all the images and then you look at the image as well. Even if you remember everything, you still have a physical look at the image. Okay, so you do the same for the whole topic and you revise all the 10 GAMTs. Okay, so this is visual recall, right? Same as mental recall, but it's a bit more deliberate, that you're actually sitting there, with the GAMT open and trying to recall it. Okay, then the next thing is called total recall. So the name suggests this is a bit more elaborate. So this typically happens when you haven't did any recall of the GAMT for a long time, so you've forgotten the GAMT. You need to have an understanding of the topic again. So you go back to the source material, you go back to the GAMT, you kind of go back to the whole process again. You read the source material, read the GAMT, go back and forth. This also applies when you want to update your GAMT. If new information is available on the topic that you already read, and if you want to add to the existing GAMT, you do this total recall where you look at the different process where you see if you can optimize the GAMT a little bit more. After this is done, this GAMT becomes a new GAMT now, right? And then zapping is what you do just before the exams. You don't try to do any active recall in your mind. You just go through the different GAMTs just visually. Okay, that's that. And the boat is for the extraordinary products. The tree is for the GAMT learning framework, and the bird is for the GAMT. So on and so forth. You just have a very quick look, zapping. Just go through. You don't have to do this, but if you want to do it, you can do this. So that's called zapping. That's what I call zapping, very quickly, just zapping through them. And then there are other active recall strategies, such as doing past exam questions, problem-based learning, and teaching others. Now, if you go back to the previous lecture on the GAMT-based learning framework, I will discuss three things there as well. So the past exam question, problem-based learning, and teaching others. These three things keep on coming every single time, because these are not only recall techniques, but they're also the place where you apply the knowledge. Okay, so you're actually doing two things here. So these three things are very, very important. So every time you come back to these three things: past exam questions, problem-based learning, teaching others, it's a very important component of your whole recall process. So how do you recall a particular GAMT? So we saw the different types of recall. Now, how do you put it into action? So what we have is something called a GAMT Recall Strategy. So it goes like this. It's the first day, the next 7 days, and Sundays. So first day, next 7 days, and Sundays. That's all you need to remember. So how does this work? So in the first day, what you try to do is you try to recall the GAMT that you learned as many times as possible. And it's important that in the first 24 hours, you do a lot of mental recall. Try to recollect the GAMT in your mind as many times as possible. And the other important thing to do in the first 24 hours is teach one other person. As we saw earlier, teaching somebody else kind of really reinforces the memory. The next 7 days, it's important that at least once a day, you do your mental recall of the GAMT. And while you're doing the mental recall of the GAMT, also try to recollect as many GAMT learning framework points as well. Okay, the GAMT learning framework is the manure to the sprout, so it's important that we kind of make it stronger. And Sundays is after the first 7 days, you at least have to recall the GAMT once a week. So when you generate a new GAMT, it's very important to apply this GAMT recall strategy. First day, next 7 days, Sunday. Right? It's easy to remember. In the long run, once you've successfully integrated GAMT into your learning, a good rule of thumb would be to set aside 10% of your learning time for GAMT learning framework recall process. So if you're learning for 1 hour, so you want to set aside 10 minutes for the GAMT and GAMT learning framework recall, so on and so forth. It's very simple, easy to apply. And what this allows you to do is to extract the maximum potential from GAMT and GAMT learning framework recall process. By effortlessly integrating the GAMT recall strategy into your regular learning, you exponentially increase the amount of information that you can retain in the long-term memory. The type of recall that you're going to use, whether it might be mental recall, visual recall, total recall, or zapping, depends on your requirement at that particular time. So, hope you got the idea of the GAMT recall strategy. We looked briefly at the forgetting curve, and we looked at the facts that we know for sure, which is spaced repetition is better than cramming, active recall is better than passive recall. Those are the only two things that's very clear. The type of spaced repetition and the types of active recall, still not very clear. Okay. Then we looked at the GAMT recall strategy. So you have the mental recall, visual recall, total recall, and zapping. Other active recall strategies include past exam questions, problem-based learning, and teaching others. Also, we looked into how to apply the recall strategy on a day-to-day basis, the first day, next 7 days, and Sundays. And also, in the long run, the rule of thumb is to set aside 10% of learning time for GAMT and GAMT learning framework recall. Please don't forget to like and subscribe the content. Visit campedia.com for more information on the techniques, and all the best with your learning process.